Section 21, or Chapter 14, Part 2, of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William McKnight. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers by Crowe, Chapter 14. I can relate numerous stories wherein the appearance of a ghost was accompanied by a light, but as there is nothing that distinguishes them from the above forementioned, I will not dilate further on this branch of the subject, on which perhaps I have said enough to suggest to the minds of my readers that, although we know little how such things are, we do know enough of analogous phenomena to enable us to believe, at least, their possibility. I confess I find much less difficulty in conceiving the existence of such facts as those described above, than those of another class of which we meet with occasional instances. For example, a gentleman of fortune and station in Ireland was one day walking along the road, when he met a very old man, apparently a peasant, though well-dressed, and looking as if he had on his Sunday habiliments. His great age attracted the gentleman's attention the more, that he could not help wondering at the alertness of his movements, and the ease with which he was ascending the hill. He consequently accosted him, inquiring his name and residence, and it was answered that his name was Kirkpatrick, and that he lived at a cottage, which he pointed out, whereupon the gentleman expressed his surprise that he should be unknown to him, since he fancied he had been acquainted with every man on his estate. "It is odd you have never seen me before," returned the old man, "for I walk here every day." "How old are you?" asked the gentleman. "I am 105, answered the other, "and have been here all my life." After a few more words, they parted, and the gentleman, proceeding towards some laborers in a neighboring field, inquired if they knew an old man of the name of Kirkpatrick. They did not, but on addressing the question to some older tenants, they said, "Oh yes, they had known him, and had been at his funeral. He had lived at the cottage on the hill, but had been dead 20 years. "How old was he when he died?" inquired the gentleman, much amazed. "He was 85, said they, so that the old man gave the age that he would have reached had he survived to the period of this rencontre. This curious incident is furnished by the gentleman himself, and all he can say is, that it certainly occurred, and that he is quite unable to explain it. He was in perfect health at the time, and had never heard of this man in his life, who had been dead several years before the estate came into his possession." The following is another curious story. The original will be found in the register of the church named, from which it has been copied for my use. Extract from the register in Brisley Church, Norfolk. December 12th, 1706. I, Robert Withers, M.A., Vicar of Gately, do insert here a story which I had from undoubted hands, for I have all the moral certainty of the truth of it possible. Mr. Gross went to see Mr. Shaw on the 2nd of August last. "As they sat talking in the evening," says Mr. Shaw, "on the 21st of the last month, as I was smoking a pipe and reading in my study, between 11 and 12 at night, in comes Mr. Naylor, formerly fellow of St. John's College, but had been dead full 4 years. When I saw him, I was much affrighted, and I asked him to sit down, which accordingly he did for about 2 hours, and we talked together. I asked him how it fared with him. He said, very well. Were any of our old acquaintances with him? No, at which I was much alarmed. But Mr. Orchard will be with me soon, and yourself not long after. And as he was going away, I asked him if he would not stay a little longer, but he refused. I asked him if he would call again. No, he had but 3 days' leave of absence, and had other business. N.B. Mr. Orchard died soon after. Mr. Shaw is now dead. He was formerly fellow of St. John's College, an ingenious good man. I knew him there, but at his death he had a college living in Oxfordshire, and here he saw the apparition. An extraordinary circumstance occurred some years ago, in which a very pious and very eminent Scotch minister, Ebenezer Brown of Inverkeithing, was concerned. A person of ill character in the neighborhood having died, the family very shortly afterward came to him to complain of some exceedingly unpleasant circumstances connected with the room in which the dissolution had taken place, which rendered it uninhabitable, and requesting his assistance. All that is known by his family of what followed is that he went and entered the room alone, came out again in a state of considerable excitement, and in a great perspiration, took off his coat and re-entered the room. A great noise, and I believe voices, were then heard by the family, who remained the whole time at the door. When he came out finally, it was evident that something very extraordinary had taken place. What it was, he said, he could never disclose, but that perhaps after his death some paper might be found upon the subject. None, however, as far as I can learn, have been discovered. A circumstance of a very singular nature is asserted to have occurred not very many years back in regard to a professor in the College of A, who had seduced a girl and married another woman. The girl became troublesome to him, and being found murdered after having been last seen in his company, he was suspected of being some way concerned in the crime. But the strange thing is that, from that period, he retired every evening to a particular hour to a certain room, where he stayed a great part of the night, and where it was declared that her voice was distinctly heard in conversation with him. A strange, wild story, which I give as I have it, without pretending to any explanation of the belief that seems to have prevailed that he was obliged to keep this fearful tryst. Visitations of this description, which seem to indicate that the deceased person is still, in some way incomprehensible to us, an inhabitant of the earth, are more perplexing than any of the stories I meet with. In the time of Frederick II of Prussia, the cook of a Catholic priest residing at a village named Crowe died, and he took another in her place. But the poor woman had no peace or rest from the interference of her predecessor, insomuch that she resigned her situation, and the minister might almost have done without any servant at all. The fires were lighted, and the rooms swept and arranged, and all the needed services performed by unseen hands. Numbers of people went to witness the phenomena, till at length the story reached the ears of the king, who sent a captain and a lieutenant of his guard to investigate the affair. As they approached the house, they found themselves preceded by a march, though they could see no musicians. And when they entered the parlor and witnessed what was going on, the captain exclaimed, "If that doesn't beat the devil," upon which he received a smart slap on the face from the invisible hand that was arranging the furniture. In consequence of this affair, the house was pulled down by the king's orders, and another residence built for the minister at some distance from the spot. Now, to impose on Frederick II would have been no slight matter, as regarded the probable consequences, and the officers of his guard would certainly not have been disposed to make the experiment. And it is not likely that the king would have ordered the house to be pulled down without being thoroughly satisfied of the truth of the story. One of the most remarkable stories of this class I know, excepting indeed the famous one, the Grecian Bride, is that which is said to have happened at Crossen in Silesia in the year 1659, in the reign of the Princess Elizabeth Charlotte. In the spring of that year, an apothecary's man called Christopher Monig, a native of Serbest in Anhalt, died, and was buried with the usual ceremonies of the Lutheran Church. But to the amazement of everybody, a few days afterwards, he, at least what seemed to be himself, appeared in the shop, where he would sit down and sometimes walk, and take from the shelves boxes, pots, and glasses, and set them again in other places, sometimes try and examine the goodness of the medicines, weigh them with the scales, pound the drugs with a mighty noise, nay, serve the people that came with bills to the shop, take their money, and lay it upon the counter. In a word, do all things that a journeyman in such cases used to do. He looked very ghostly upon his former companions, who were afraid to say anything to him, and his master being sick at that time, he was very troublesome to him. At last he took a cloak that hung in the shop, put it on, and walked abroad. But minding nobody in the streets, he entered into some of the citizens' houses, especially such as he had formerly known, yet spoke to no one but to a maidservant, whom he met with hard by the churchyard, whom he desired to go home and dig in a lower chamber of her master's house, where she would find an inestimable treasure. But the girl, amazed at the sight of him, swooned away, whereupon he lifted her up, but left a mark upon her, in so doing, that was long visible. She fell sick in consequence of the fright, and having told what Monig had said to her, they dug up the place indicated, but found nothing but a decayed pot, with a Hermerites or bloodstone in it. The affair making a great noise, the reigning princess caused the man's body to be taken up, which being done, it was found in a state of putrefaction, and was reinterred. The apothecary was then recommended to remove everything belonging to Monig, his linen, clothes, and books, after which the apparition left the house and was seen no more. The fact of the man's reappearance in this matter was considered to be so perfectly established at that time that there was actually a public disputation of the subject in the Academy of Leipzig. With regard to the importance of the apparition attached to the bloodstone, we do not know, but there may be truth in the persuasion that this gem is possessed of some occult properties of much more value than its beauty. The story of the Grecian Bride is still more wonderful, and yet it comes to us so surprisingly well authenticated, inasmuch as the details were forwarded by the prefect of the city in which the thing occurred to the proconsul of his province, and by the latter were laid before the Emperor Hadrian. And as it was not the custom to mystify Roman emperors, we are constrained to believe that what the prefect and proconsul communicated to him, they had good reason for believing themselves. It appears that a gentleman called Demostrates and Charito, his wife, had a daughter called Philinion, who died, and that about 6 months afterwards a youth named Michaelides, who had come to visit them, was surprised on retiring to the apartments destined to strangers by receiving the visits of a young maiden who eats and drinks and exchanges gifts with him. Some accident having taken the nurse that way, she, amazed by the sight, summons her master and mistress to behold their daughter, who is sitting there with the guests. Of course they do not believe her, but at length, worried by her importunities, the mother followed her to the guest chambers. But the young people are now asleep, and the door closed. But looking through the keyhole, she perceives what she believes to be her daughter. Still unable to credit her senses, she resolves to wait until morning before disturbing them. But when she comes again, the young lady had departed, while Michaelides, on being interrogated, confesses that Philinion had been with him, but that she had admitted to him that it was unknown to her parents. Upon this, the amazement and agitation of the mother were naturally very great, especially when Michaelides showed her a ring which the girl had given him, and a bodice which he had left behind, and his amazement was no less when he heard the story they had to tell. He, however, promised that if she returned the next night, he would let them see her, for he found it impossible to believe that his bride was their dead daughter. He suspected, on the contrary, that some thieves had stripped her body of the clothes and ornaments in which she had been buried, and that the girl who came to his room had bought them. When, therefore, she arrived, his servant, having orders to summon the father and mother, they came, and perceiving that it was really their daughter, they fell to embracing her with tears. But she reproached them for the intrusion, declaring that she had been permitted to spend 3 days with this stranger in the house of her birth, but that now she must go to the appointed place, and immediately fell down dead, and the dead body lay there visible to all. The news of this strange event soon spread abroad. The house was surrounded by crowds of people, and the prefect was obliged to take measures to avoid a tumult. On the following morning, at an early hour, the inhabitants assembled in the theater, and thence they proceeded to the vault, in order to ascertain if the body of Philinion was there, where it had been deposited 6 months before. It was not, but on the bier there lay the ring and cap which Michaelides had presented to her the first night she visited him, showing that she had returned there in the interim. They then proceeded to the house of Democritus, where they saw the body, which it was decreed must now be buried without the bounds of the city. Numerous religious ceremonies and sacrifices followed, and the unfortunate Michaelides, seized with horror, put an end to his own life. The following very singular circumstance occurred in this country toward the latter end of last century, and excited at the time considerable attention. The more so as it was asserted by everyone acquainted with the people and the locality that the removal of the body was impossible by any recognized means, besides that no one would have the hardihood to attempt such a feat. Mr. William Craighead, author of A Popular System of Arithmetic, was parish schoolmaster of Montefife, situate upon the estuary of the Tay, about 6 miles east from Dundee. It would appear that Mr. Craighead was then a young man, fond of a frolic, without being very scrupulous about the means or calculating the consequences, there being a like wake in the neighborhood, according to the custom of the times. Attended by a number of his acquaintance, Craighead procured a confederate, with whom he concerted a plan to draw the watchers from the house, or at least from the room where the corpse lay. Having succeeded in this, he dexterously removed the dead body to an outer house, while his companion occupied the place of the corpse in the bed where it had lain. It was agreed upon between the Confederates that when the company were reassembled, Craighead was to join them, and at a concerted signal, the impostor was to rise, shrouded like the dead man, while the two were to enjoy the terror and alarm of their companions. Mr. Craighead came in, and after being some time seated, the signal was made, but met no attention. He was rather surprised. It was repeated, and still neglected. Mr. Craighead, in turn, now became alarmed, for he conceived it impossible that his companion could have fallen asleep in that situation. His uneasiness became insupportable. He went to the bed, and found his friend lifeless. Mr. Craighead's feelings, as may well be imagined, now entirely overpowered him, and the dreadful act was disclosed. Their agitation was extreme, and it was far from being alleviated when every attempt to restore animation to the thoughtless young man proved abortive. As soon as their confusion would permit, an inquiry was made after the original corpse, and Mr. Craighead and another went to fetch it in, but it was not to be found. The alarm and consternation of the company were now redoubled. For some time a few suspected that some hardy fellow among them had been attempting a Roland for an Oliver, but when every knowledge of it was most solemnly denied by all present, the situation can more easily be imagined than described. That of Mr. Craighead was little short of distraction. Daylight came without relieving their agitation. No trace of the corpse could be discovered, and Mr. Craighead was accused as the premium mobile of all that had happened. He was incapable of sleeping, and wandered several days and nights in search of the body, which was at last discovered in the parish of Teeling, deposited in a field about 6 miles distant from the place where it was removed. It is related that this extraordinary affair had a strong and lasting effect upon Mr. Craighead's mind and conduct, that he immediately became serious and thoughtful, and ever after conducted himself with great prudence and sobriety. Among what are called superstitions, there are a great many curious ones attached to certain families, and from some members of these families I have been assured that experience has rendered it impossible for them to forbear attaching importance to these persuasions. A very remarkable circumstance occurred lately in this part of the world, the facts of which I had an opportunity of being well acquainted with. One evening, somewhere around Christmas of the year 1844, a letter was sent for my perusal, which had been just received from a member of a distinguished family in Perthshire. The friend who sent it to me, an eminent library man, said, "Read the enclosed, and we shall now have an opportunity of observing if any event follows the prognostics." The information contained in the letter was to the following effect. Miss D, a relative of the present Lady C, who had been staying some time with the Earl and Countess at their seat near Dundee, was invited to spend a few days at C Castle with the Earl and Countess of A. She went, and while she was dressing for dinner, the first evening of her arrival, she heard a strain of music under her window, which finally resolved itself into a well-defined sound of a drum. When her maid came up the stairs, she made some inquiries about the drummer that was playing near the house, but the maid knew nothing upon the subject. For the moment, the circumstance passed from Miss D.'s mind, but recurring to her again during the dinner, she said, addressing Lord A., "My lord, who was your drummer?" Upon which his lordship turned pale. Lady A looked distressed, and several of the company, who all heard the question, embarrassed, while the lady, perceiving that she had made some unpleasant allusion, although she knew not to what their feelings referred, forbore further inquiry till she reached the drawing-room, when, having mentioned the circumstance again to a member of the family, she was answered, "What? Have you never heard of the drummer boy?" "No," replied Miss D. "Who in the world is he?" "Why," replied the other, "he is a person who goes about the house playing his drum whenever there is a death impending in the family. The last time he was heard was shortly before the death of the last countess, the Earl's former wife, and that is why Lord A became so pale when you mentioned it. This drummer is a very unpleasant subject in this family, I assure you." Miss D was naturally much concerned, and indeed not a little frightened at this explanation, and her alarm being augmented by hearing the sounds on the following day, she took her departure from C Castle, returned to Lord C.'s, stopping on her way to call on some friends, where she related this strange circumstance to the family, through whom the information reached me. This affair was very generally known in the north, and we awaited the event with interest, the melancholy death of the Countess about 5 or 6 months afterwards at Brighton sadly verified the prognostic. I have heard that a paper was found in her desk, after her death, declaring her conviction that the drum was for her, and has been suggested that probably the thing preyed upon her mind and caused the catastrophe. But in the first place, from the mode of her death, that does not appear to be the case. In the second, even if it were, the fact of the verification of the prognostic remains unaffected, besides which, those who insist upon taking refuge in this hypothesis must admit that, before people living in the world like Lord and Lady A could attach so much importance to the prognostic as to entail such fatal effects, they must have had very good reason for believing in it. The legend connected with the drummer is that either himself or some other officer whose emissary he was had become an object of jealousy to a former Lord A, and that he was put to death by being thrust into his own drum and flung from the window of the tower in which Miss D's room was situated. It is said that he threatened to haunt them if they took his life, and he seems to have been as good as his word, having been heard several times in the memory of persons yet living. There is a curious legend attached to the family of G, of R, to the effect that when a lady is confined in that house, a little old woman enters the room when the nurse is absent, and strokes down the bedclothes, after which the patient, according to the technical phrase, never does any good, and dies. Whether the old lady has paid her visits or not, I do not know, but it is remarkable that the results attending several late confinements there have been fatal. There was a legend in a certain family that a single swan was seen on a particular lake before a death. A member of this family told me that on one occasion the father, being a widower, was about to enter into a second marriage. On the wedding day, his son appeared so exceedingly distressed that the bridegroom was offended, and, expostulating with him, was told by the young man that his low spirits were caused by his having seen the swan. He, the son, died that night, quite unexpectedly. Besides Lord Lyttelton's dove, there are a great many very curious stories recorded in which birds have been seen in a room when a death was impending, but the most extraordinary prognostic I know of is that of the black dog, which seems to be attached to some families. A young lady of the name of P, not long since, was sitting at work well and cheerful, when she saw, to her great surprise, a large black dog close to her. As both door and window were closed, she could not understand how he'd gotten in. But when she started to put him out, she could no longer see him. Quite puzzled, and thinking it must be some strange illusion, she sat down again and went on with her work, when presently he was there again. Much alarmed, she now ran out and told her mother, who said she must have fancied it or be ill. She declared neither was the case, and to oblige her, mother agreed to wait outside the door. If she saw it again, she was to call her. Miss P re-entered the room, and presently there was the dog again. But when she called her mother, he disappeared. Immediately afterward, the mother was taken ill and died. Before she expired, she said to her daughter, "Remember the black dog. I confess, I should have been much disposed to think this is a spectral illusion, were it not for the number of corroborative instances. And I have only this morning read in the review of a work called The Unseen World, just published, that there is a family in Cornwall who are also warned of an approaching death by the apparition of a black dog. And a very curious example is quoted, in which a lady newly married into the family, and knowing nothing of the tradition, came down from the nursery to request her husband would go up and drive away a black dog that was lying on the child's bed. He went up and found the child dead. I wonder if this phenomenon is the origin of the French phrase bête noire, to express an annoyance or an augury of evil. Most persons will remember the story of Lady Fanshawe as related by herself, namely, that while paying a visit to Lady Honor O'Brien, she was awakened the first night she slept there by a voice, and on drawing back the curtain, she saw a female figure standing in the recess of the window, attired in white, with red hair, and a pale and ghastly aspect. She looked out of the window, says Lady Fanshawe, and cried in a loud voice, such as I had never heard before, "A horse, a horse, a horse!" And then, with a sigh, which rather resembled the wind than the voice of a human being, she disappeared. Her body appeared to me rather like a thick cloud than a real solid substance. I was so frightened. She continues, that my hair stood on end, and my nightcap fell off. I pushed and shook my husband, who had slept all the time, and who was very much surprised to find me in such a fright, and still more so when I told him the cause of it, and showed him the open window. Neither of us slept any more that night, but he talked to me about it and told me how much more frequent such apparitions were in that country than in England. This was, however, what is called a banshee, for in the morning Lady Honor came to them to say that one of the family had died in the night, expressing a hope that they had not been disturbed. For, said she, whenever any of the O'Briens is on his deathbed, it is usual for a woman to appear at one of the windows every night till he expires. But when I put you into his room, I did not think of it. This apparition was connected with some sad tale of seduction and murder. I could relate many more instances of this kind, but I wish as much as possible to avoid repeating cases already in print. So I will conclude this chapter with the following account of Pearlin Jean, whose persevering annoyances at Allenbach was so thoroughly believed and established as to have formed at various times a considerable impediment to letting the place. I am indebted to Mr. Charles Kirkpatrick Sharp for the account of Jean and the anecdote that follows. A housekeeper called Bet Noor, that lived many years at Allenbach, declared she and various other people had frequently seen Jean, adding that they were so used to her as to no longer be alarmed at her noises. In my youth, says Mr. Sharp, Pearlin Jean was the most remarkable ghost in Scotland, and my terror when a child. Our old nurse, Jenny Blackladder, had been a servant at Allenbach, and often heard her rustling in silks up and down stairs and along the passage. She never saw her, but her husband did. She was a French woman, whom the first baronet of Allenbach, then Mr. Stewart, met with at Paris during his first tour to finish his education as a gentleman. Some people said she was a nun, in which case she must have been a sister of charity, as she appears not to have been confined to a cloister. After some time, young Stewart became either faithless to the lady or suddenly recalled to Scotland by his parents, and had got into his carriage at the door of the hotel when his Dido unexpectedly made her appearance, and stepping on the forewheel of the coach to address her lover, he ordered the postilion to drive on, the consequence of which was that the lady fell, and one of the wheels, going over her forehead, killed her. In a dusky autumn evening, when Mr. Stewart drove under the arched gateway of Allenbach, he perceived Pearlin Jean sitting on the top, her head and shoulders covered with blood. After this, for many years, the house was haunted. Doors shut and opened with great noise at midnight, and the rustling of silks and pattering of high-heeled shoes were heard in bedrooms and passages. Nurse Jenny said there were 7 ministers called together at one time to lay the spirit, but they did no mickle good, my dear. This picture of the ghost was hung between those of her lover and his lady, and kept her comparatively quiet, but when taken away, she became worse-natured than ever. This portrait was in the present Sir J.G.'s possession. I am unwilling to record its fate. The ghost was designated Pearlin, from always wearing a great quantity of that sort of lace. Nurse Jenny told me that when Thomas Blackladder was her lover, I remember Thomas very well, they made an assignation to meet one moonlight night in the orchard at Allenbach. True Thomas, of course, was the first comer, and seeing a female figure in a light-colored dress at some distance, he ran forward with open arms to embrace his Jenny. Lo and behold, as he neared the spot where the figure stood, it vanished, and presently he saw it again, at the very end of the orchard, a considerable way off. Thomas went home in fright, but Jenny, who came last and saw nothing, forgave him, and they were married. Many years after this, about the year 1790, 2 ladies paid a visit to Allenbach. I think the house was then let, and passed a night there. They had never heard a word about the ghost, but they were disturbed the whole night with something walking backward and forward in their bedchamber. This I heard from the best authority. Sir Robert Stewart was created a baronet in the year 1687. Lady Stapleton, grandmother of the late Lord de Despencer, told me that the night lady, Susan Fane, Lord Westmoreland's daughter, died in London. She appeared to her father, then at Merryworth in Kent. He was in bed, but had not fallen asleep. There was a light in the room. She came in and sat down on a chair at the foot of the bed. He said to her, Good, Susan, how came you here? What has brought you from town? She made no answer, but rose directly and went to the door and looked back toward him very earnestly. Then she retired, shutting the door behind her. The next morning, he had notice of her death. This Lord Westmoreland himself told to Lady Stapleton, who was by birth a Fane, and his near relation. End of Section 21 and end of Chapter 14. Recorded by William McKnight, Plano, Texas.
The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Chapter 15. Chapter 15, Part 1 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Chapter 15, Apparitions Seeking the Prayers of the Living. Part 1. With regard to the appearance of ghosts, the frequency of haunted houses, presentiments, prognostics, and dreams, if we come to inquire closely, it appears to me that all parts of the world are much on an equality, only that where people are most engaged in business or pleasure, these things are in the first place less thought of and less believed in, consequently less observed, and when they are observed, they are readily explained away, and in the second place, where the external life, the life of the brain, wholly prevails, either they do not happen, or they are not perceived, the rapport not existing, or the receptive faculty being obscured. But although the above phenomena seem to be equally well known in all countries, there is one peculiar class of apparitions of which I meet with no records but in Germany. I allude to ghosts, who, like those described in the Seeress of Prevorst, seek the prayers of the living. In spite of the positive assertions of Kerner, Eschenmayer, and others, that after neglecting no means to investigate the affair, they had been forced into the conviction that the spectres that frequented Friederike Hauff were not subjective illusions, but real outstanding forms. Still, as she was in the somnambulic state, many persons remained persuaded that the whole thing was delusion. It is true that as those parties were not there, and as all those who did go to the spot came to a different conclusion, this opinion being only the result of preconceived notions or prejudices, and not of calm investigation, is of no value whatever. Nevertheless, it is not to be denied that these narrations are very extraordinary, but perplexing as they are, they by no means stand alone. I find many similar ones noticed in various works, where there has been no somnambule in question. In all cases, these unfortunate spirits appear to have been waiting for someone with whom they could establish a rapport, so as to be able to communicate with them, and this waiting has sometimes endured a century or more. Sometimes they are seen by only one person, at other times by several, with varying degrees of distinctness, appearing to one as a light, to another as a shadowy figure, and to a third as a defined human form. Other testimonies of their presence, as sounds, footsteps, lights, visible removing of solid articles without a visible agent, odors, etc., are generally perceived by many. In short, the sounds seem audible to all who come to the spot, with the exception of the voice, which in most instances is only heard by the person with whom the rapport is chiefly established. Some cases are related where a mark like burning is left on the articles seen to be lifted. This is an old persuasion, and has given rise to many a joke, but upon the hypothesis I have offered, the thing is simple enough. The mark will probably be of the same nature as that left by the electrical fluid, and it is this particular, and the lights that often accompany spirits, that have caused the notion of material flames, sulphur, brimstone, etc., to be connected with the idea of a future state. According to our views, there can be no difficulty in conceiving that a happy and blessed spirit would emit a mild radiance, while anger or malignity would necessarily alter the character of the effulgence. As whoever wishes to see a number of these cases may have recourse to my translation of the Seeress of Prevorst, I will here only relate one, of a very remarkable nature, that occurred in the prison of Weinsberg in the year 1835. Dr. Kerner, who has published a little volume containing a report of the circumstances, describes the place where the thing happened to be such a one as negatives at once all possibility of trick or imposture. It was in a sort of blockhouse or fortress, a prison within a prison, with no windows but what looked into a narrow passage closed with several doors. It was on the second floor, the windows were high up, heavily barred with iron, and immovable without considerable mechanical force. The external prison is surrounded by a high wall, and the gates are kept closed day and night. The prisoners in different apartments are of course never allowed to communicate with each other, and the deputy governor of the prison and his family, consisting of a wife, niece, and one maidservant, are described as people of unimpeachable respectability and veracity. As depositions regarding this affair were laid before the magistrates, it is on them that I found my narration. On the 12th of September, 1835, the deputy governor or keeper of the jail, named Weir, sent in a report to the magistrates that a woman called Elizabeth Esslinger was every night visited by a ghost, which generally came about 11 o'clock, and which left her no rest, as it said she was destined to release it, and it always invited her to follow it, and as she would not, it pressed heavily on her neck and side till it gave her pain. The persons confined with her pretended also to have seen this apparition. Signed, Weir. A woman named Rosina Schall, condemned to 8 days' confinement for abusive language, deposed that about 11 o'clock Esslinger began to breathe hard, as if she was suffocating. She said a ghost was with her, seeking his salvation. I did not trouble myself about it, but told her to wake me when it came again. Last night I saw a shadowy form between 4 and 5 feet high standing near the bed. I did not see it move. Esslinger breathed very hard and complained of a pressure on the side. For several days she has neither ate nor drank anything. Signed, Schall. Court resolves that Esslinger is to be visited by the prison physician, and a report made as to her mental and bodily health. Signed by the magistrates, Eckhart, Thurer, Knorr. Report. Having examined the prisoner, Elizabeth Esslinger, confined here since the beginning of September, I found her of sound mind, but possessed with one fixed idea, namely, that she is and has been for a considerable time troubled by an apparition, which leaves her no rest, coming chiefly by night, and requiring her prayers to release it. It visited her before she came to the prison, and was the cause of the offence that brought her here. Having now, in compliance with the orders of the Supreme Court, observed this woman for 11 weeks, I am led to the conclusion that there is no deception in this case, and also that the persecution is not a mere monomaniacal idea of her own, and the testimony not only of her fellow prisoners, but that of the deputy governor's family, and even of persons in distant houses, confirms me in this persuasion. Esslinger is a widow, aged 38 years, and declares that she never had any sickness whatever, neither is she aware of any at present, but she has always been a ghost-seer, though never till lately had any communication with them. But now, for 11 weeks that she has been in the prison, she is nightly disturbed by an apparition that previously visited her in her own house, and which had once been seen also by a girl of 14, a statement which this girl confirms. When at home the apparition did not appear in a defined human form, but as a pillar of cloud, out of which proceeded a hollow voice, signifying to her that she was to release it, by her prayers, from the cellar of a woman in Wimmenthal, named Singhassin, whither it was banished, or whence it could not free itself. She, Esslinger, says that she did not then venture to speak to it, not knowing whether to address it as Sie, Ich, or Du, that is, whether she should address it in the second or third person, which custom among the Germans has rendered a very important point of etiquette. It is to be remembered that this woman was a peasant, without education, who had been brought into trouble by treasure-seeking, a pursuit which she hoped to be assisted by this spirit. This digging for buried treasure is a strong passion in Germany. The ghost now comes in a perfect human shape, and is dressed in a loose robe with a girdle, and has on its head a 4-cornered cap. It has a projecting chin and forehead, fiery, deep-set eyes, a long beard, and high cheekbones, which look as if they were covered with parchment. A light radiates about and above his head, and in the midst of this light she sees the outlines of the spectre. Both she and her fellow prisoners declare that this apparition comes several times in a night, but always between the evening and morning bell. He often comes through the closed door or window, but they can see neither door nor window, nor iron bars. They often hear the closing of the door, and can see into the passage when he comes in or out that way, so that if a piece of wood lies there they see it. They hear a shuffling in the passage as he comes and goes. He most frequently enters by a window, and they then hear a peculiar sound there. He comes in quite erect. Although their cell is entirely closed, they feel a cool wind when he is near them. All sorts of noises are heard, particularly a crackling. When he is angry or in great trouble, they perceive a strange mouldering, earthy smell. He often pulls away the coverlet and sits on the edge of the bed. At first the touch of his hand was icy cold. Since he became brighter, it is warmer. She first saw the brightness of his finger ends. It afterwards spread further. If she stretches out her hand, she cannot feel him, but when he touches her, she feels it. He sometimes takes her hands and lays them together to make her pray. His sighs and groans are like a person in despair. They are heard by others as well as Esslinger. While he is making these sounds, she is often praying aloud or talking to her companions, so they are sure it is not she who makes them. She does not see his mouth move when he speaks. The voice is hollow and gasping. He comes to her for prayers, and he seems to her like one in a mortal sickness, who seeks comfort in the prayers of others. He says he was a Catholic priest in Wimmenthal, and lived in the year 1414. Wimmenthal is still Catholic. The woman Esslinger herself is a Lutheran, and belongs to Backnang. He says that among other crimes, a fraud committed conjointly with his father on his brothers presses sorely on him. He cannot get quit of it. It obstructs him. He always entreated her to go with him to Wimmenthal, whither he was banished or consigned, and pray there for him. She says she cannot tell whether what he says is true, and does not deny that she thought to find treasures by his aid. She has often told him that the prayers of a sinner like herself cannot help him, and that he should seek the Redeemer, but he will not forbear his entreaties. When she says these things, he is sad, and presses nearer to her, and lays his hand so close that she is obliged to pray into his mouth. He seems hungry for prayers. She has often felt his tears on her cheek and neck. They feel icy cold, but the spot soon after burns, and they have a bluish-red mark. These marks are visible on her skin. One night this apparition brought with him a large dog, which leaped on the beds, and was seen by her fellow prisoners also, who were much terrified, and screamed. The ghost, however, spoke and said, "Fear not, this is my father." He has since brought the dog with him again, which alarmed them dreadfully and made them quite ill. Both Weir and the prisoners asserted that Esslinger was scarcely seen to sleep, either by night or day, for 10 weeks. She ate very little, prayed continually, and appeared very much wasted and exhausted. She said she saw the spectre alike, whether her eyes were opened or closed, which showed that it was a magnetic perception, and not seeing by her bodily organs. It is remarkable that a cat belonging to the jail, being shut up in this room, was so frightened when the apparition came that it tried to make its escape by flying against the walls, and finding this impossible, it crept under the coverlet of the bed in extreme terror. The experiment was made again, with the same result, and after this second time the animal refused all nourishment, wasted away, and died. In order to satisfy myself, says Dr. Kerner, of the truth of these depositions, I went to the prison on the night of the 15th of October, and shut myself up without light in Esslinger's cell. About 11:30 I heard a sound as of some hard body being flung down, but not on the side where the woman was, but the opposite. She immediately began to breathe hard, and told me the spectre was there. I laid my hand on her heart, and adjured it as an evil spirit to depart. I had scarcely spoken the words when there was a strange rattling, crackling noise, all round the walls, which finally seemed to go out through the window, and the woman said that the spectre had departed. On the following night it told her that it was grieved at being addressed as an evil spirit, which it was not, but one that deserved pity, and that what it wanted was prayers and redemption. On the 18th of October I went to the cell again, between 10 and 11, taking with me my wife and the wife of the keeper, Madame Weir. When the woman's breathing showed me that the spectre was there, I laid my hand on her and adjured it, in gentle terms, not to trouble her further. The same sort of sound as before commenced, but it was softer, and this time continued all along the passage, where there was certainly nobody. We all heard it. On the night of the 20th I went again, with Justice Haid. We both heard sounds when the spectre came, and the woman could not conceive why we did not see it. We could not, but we distinctly felt a cool wind blowing upon us when, according to her account, it was near, although there was no aperture by which air could enter. On each of these occasions Dr. Kerner seemed to have remained about a couple of hours. Madame Weir now resolved to pass a night in the cell for the purpose of observation, and she took her niece, a girl aged 19, with her. Her report is as follows. It was a rainy night, and in the prison pitch dark. My niece slept sometimes. I remained awake all night, mostly sitting up in bed. About midnight, I saw a light come in at the window. It was a yellowish light, and moved slowly, and though we were closely shut in, I felt a cool wind blowing on me. I said to the woman, "The ghost is here, is he not?" She said, "Yes," and continued to pray, as she had been doing before. The cool wind and the light now approached me. My coverlet was quite light, and I could see my hands and arms, and at the same time I perceived an indescribable odor of putrefaction. My face felt as if ants were running over it. Most of the prisoners described themselves as feeling the same sensation when the spectre was there. Then the light moved about, and went up and down the room, and on the door of the cell I saw a number of little glimmering stars, such as I had never before seen. Presently I and my niece heard a voice which I can compare to nothing I ever heard before. It was not like a human voice. The words and sighs sounded as if they were drawn up out of a deep hollow, and appeared to ascend from the floor to the roof in a column. While this voice spoke, the woman was praying aloud, so I was sure it did not proceed from her. No one could produce such a sound. They were strange superhuman sighs and entreaties for prayers and redemption. It is very extraordinary that whenever the ghost spoke I always felt it beforehand. Proving that the spirit had been able to establish a rapport with this person, she was in a magnetic relation to him. We heard a crackling in the room also. I was perfectly awake and in possession of my senses, and we are ready to make oath to having seen and heard these things. On the 9th of December, Madame Weir spent the night again in the cell, with her niece and her maidservant, and her report is as follows. It was moonlight, and I sat up in bed all night watching Esslinger. Suddenly I saw a white shadowy form like a small animal cross the room. I asked her what it was, and she answered, "Don't you see it's a lamb? It often comes with the apparition." We then saw a stool that was near us, lifted and set down again on its legs. She was in bed and praying the whole time. Presently there was such a noise at the window that I thought all the panes were broken. She told us it was the ghost, and that he was sitting on the stool. We then heard a walking and shuffling up and down, although I could not see him, but presently I felt a cool wind blowing on me, and out of this wind the same hollow voice I had heard before said, "In the name of Jesus, look on me." Before this the moon was gone, and it was quite dark, but when the voice spoke to me I saw a light around us, though still no form. Then there was a sound of walking toward the opposite window, and I heard the voice say, "Do you see me now?" And then, for the first time, I saw a shadowy form stretching up as if to make itself visible to us, but could distinguish no features. During the rest of the night I saw it repeatedly, sometimes sitting on the stool, and at others moving about, and I am perfectly certain that there was no moonlight now, nor any other light from without. How I saw it I cannot tell. It is a thing not to be described. Esslinger prayed the whole time, and the more earnestly she did so, the closer the spectre went to her. It sometimes sat upon her bed. About 5 o'clock, when he came near to me and I felt the cool air, I said, "Go to my husband in his chamber, and leave a sign that you have been there." He answered distinctly, "Yes." Then we heard the door, which was fast locked, open and shut, and we saw the shadow float out, for he floated rather than walked, and we heard the shuffling along the passage. In a quarter of an hour we saw him return, entering by the window, and I asked him if he had been with my husband and what he had done. He answered by a sound like a short, low, hollow laugh. Then he hovered about without any noise, and we heard him speaking to Esslinger, while she still prayed aloud. Still, as before, I always knew when he was going to speak. After 6 o'clock we saw him no more. In the morning my husband mentioned with great surprise that his chamber door, which he was sure he had fast bolted and locked, even taking out the key when he went to bed, he had found wide open. On the 24th Madame Weir passed the night there again, but on this occasion she only saw a white shadow coming and going, and standing by the woman who prayed unceasingly. She also heard the shuffling. Between prisoners and the persons in authority who went to observe, the number of those who testify to this phenomenon is considerable, and although the amount of what was perceived varied according to the receptivity of the subject in each case, the evidence of all is perfectly coincident as to the character of the phenomena. Some saw only the light, others distinguished the form in the midst of it all heard the sound, and perceived the mouldering earthy smell. That the receptivity of the women was greater than that of the men, after what I have elsewhere said, should excite no surprise, the preponderance of the sympathetic system in them being sufficient to account for the difference. Frederica Fallen, from Lowenstein, who was 8 weeks in the same cell with Esslinger, was witness to all the phenomena, though she only once arrived at seeing the spectre in its perfect human form, as the latter saw it, but it frequently spoke to her, bidding her amend her life, and remember that it was one who had tasted of death that gave her this counsel. This circumstance had a great effect upon her. When any of them swore, the apparition always evinced much displeasure, grasped them by the throat, and forced them to pray. Frequently, when he came or went, they said it sounded like a flight of pigeons. Catherine Sin, from Mayenfels, was confined in an adjoining room for a fortnight. After her release she was interrogated by the minister of her parish, and deposed that she had known nothing of Esslinger or the spectre, but every night, being quite alone, I heard a rustling and a noise at the window, which looked only into the passage. I felt and heard, though I could not see anybody, that someone was moving about the room. These sounds were accompanied by a cool wind, though the place was closely shut up. I also heard a crackling and a shuffling, and a sound as if gravel were thrown, but could find none in the morning. Once it seemed to me that a hand was laid softly on my forehead. I did not like staying alone, on account of these things, and begged to be put in a room with others, so I was placed with Esslingen and Fallen. The same things continued here, and they told me about the ghost, but not being alone, I was not so frightened. I often heard him speak. It was hollow and slow, not like a human voice, but I could seldom catch the words. When he left the prison, which was generally about 5 in the morning, he used to say, "Pray," and when he did so, he would add, "God reward you." I never saw him distinctly till the last morning I was there. Then I saw a white shadow standing by Esslinger's bed. Signed, Catherine Sin. Minister Binder, Mayenfels. It would be tedious were I to copy the depositions of all the prisoners, the experience of most of them being similar to the above. I will therefore content myself with giving an abstract of the most remarkable particulars. Besides the crackling, rustling as of paper, walking, shuffling, concussions of the window and of their beds, etc., etc., they heard sometimes a fearful cry, and not unfrequently the bed-coverings were pulled from them, it appearing to be the object of the spirit to manifest himself thus to those whom he could not make himself visible, and as I find this pulling off of the bedclothes, and heaving up of the bed as if someone were under it, repeated in a variety of cases, foreign and English, I conclude the motive to be the same. Several of the women heard him speak. All these depositions are contained in Dr. Kerner's report to the magistrates, and he concludes by saying that there can be no doubt of the fact of the woman Elizabeth Esslinger suffering these annoyances, by whatever name people may choose to call them. Among the most remarkable phenomena is the real or apparent opening of the door, so that they could see what was in the passage. Esslinger said that the spirit was often surrounded by a light, and his eyes looked fiery, and there sometimes came with him 2 lambs, which occasionally appeared as stars. He often took hold of Esslinger, and made her sit up, put her hands together, that she might pray, and once he appeared to take a pen and paper from under his gown and wrote, laying it on the coverlet. It is extremely curious that on 2 occasions Esslinger saw Dr. Kerner and Justice Hyde enter with the ghost when they were not there in the body, and both times Hyde was enveloped in a black cloud. The ghost, on being asked, told Esslinger that the cloud indicated that trouble was impending. A few days afterward his child died very unexpectedly, and Dr. Kerner now remembered that the first time Esslinger said she had seen Hyde in this way, his father had died directly afterward. Kerner attended both patients, and was thus associated in the symbol. Fallen also saw these 2 images, and spoke, believing the one to be Dr. Kerner himself. On other occasions she saw strangers come in with the ghost, whom afterward, when they really came in the body, she recognized. This seems to have been a sort of second sight. Dr. K says, I think justly enough, that if Eslinger had been feigning, she would never have ventured on what seemed so improbable. Some of the women, after the spectre had visibly leaned over them, or had spoken into their ears, were so affected by the odor he diffused that they vomited, and could not eat till they had taken an emetic, and those parts of their persons that he touched became painful and swollen, an effect I find produced in numerous other instances. End of Chapter 15, Part 1. Chapter 15 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Barclay. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 15, Part 2. Apparitions Seeking the Prayers of the Living. The following particulars are worth observing, in the evidence of a girl 16 years of age called Margaret Labisberg, who was confined for 10 days for plucking some grapes in a vineyard. She says she knew nothing about the spectre, but that she was greatly alarmed the first night at hearing the door burst open and something come shuffling in. Eslinger bade her not fear, and said it would not injure her. The girl, however, being greatly terrified every night, and hiding her head under the bedclothes, on the 4th, Eslinger got out of her own bed, and coming to her said, Do in the name of God look at him. He will do you no harm, I assure you. Then, says the girl, I looked out from under the clothes and saw 2 white forms like 2 lambs, so beautiful that I could have looked at them forever. Between them stood a white shadowy form as tall as a man, but I was not able to look longer, for my eyes failed me. The terrors of this girl were so great that Eslinger had repeatedly occasion to get out of bed and fetch her to lie with herself. When she could be induced to look, she always saw the figure, and he bade her also pray for him. Whenever he touched her, which he did on the forehead and eyes, she felt pain, but says nothing of any subsequent swelling. Both this girl and another called Neidhart, who was brought in on the last day of Margaret L.'s imprisonment, testified that on the previous night they had heard Eslinger ask the ghost why he looked so angry, and that they had heard him answer that it was because she had, on the preceding night, neglected to pray for him as much as usual, which neglect arose from 2 gentlemen having passed the night in the cell. When on the 10th day the girl Margaret L. was released, she said there was something so awful to her in this apparition that she had firmly resolved and vowed to be pious and lead henceforth a virtuous life. Some of them seemed to have felt little alarm. Maria Barr, aged 41, said, I was not afraid, for I have a good conscience. The offences for which these women were confined appear to have been very slight ones, such as quarrelling, etc. In a room that opened into the same passage, men were shut up for disputing with the police, neglect of regulations, and similar misdemeanours. These persons not only heard the noises as above described, such as the walking, shuffling, opening and shutting the door, etc., etc., but some of them saw the ghost. Christian Bauer deposed that he had never heard anything about the ghost, but that being disturbed by a knocking and rustling toward 3 o'clock on the 2nd morning of his incarceration, he looked up and saw a white figure bending over him, and heard a strange hollow voice say, You must needs have patience. He said he thought it must be his grandfather, at which Stricker, his companion, laughed. Stricker deposed that he heard a hollow voice say, You must needs have patience, and that Bauer told him that there was a white apparition near him, and that he supposed it was his grandfather. Bauer said he was frightened the first night, but got used to it and did not mind. It is my worthy observation that when they heard the door of the women's room open, they also heard the voice of Eslinger praying, which seems as if the door not only appeared to open, but actually did so. We have already seen that this spirit could open doors. In the Seeress of Prevorst, the doors were constantly audibly and visibly opened, as by an unseen hand, and when she saw a spectre enter, and I know to an absolute certainty that the same phenomenon takes place in a house not far from where I am writing, and this sometimes when there are 2 people sleeping in the room, a lady and a gentleman, the door having been fast locked when they went to bed, the room thoroughly examined and every precaution taken, for they are unwilling to believe in the spiritual character of the disturbances that annoy them. They are aroused by a consciousness that it is opening, and they do find it open on rising to investigate the fact. One of the remarkable proofs, either of the force of volition or of the electrical powers of the apparition that haunted Eslinger, or else of his power to imitate sounds, was the real or apparent violent shaking of the heavy iron-barred window, which it is asserted the united efforts of 6 men could not shake at all when they made the experiment. The Supreme Court having satisfied itself that there was no imposture in this case, it was proposed that some men of science should be invited to investigate the strange phenomenon, and endeavor, if possible, to explain it. Accordingly, not only Dr. Kerner himself and his son, but many others passed nights in the prison for this purpose. Among these, besides some ministers of the Lutheran Church, there was an engraver called Dutenhofer, Wagner, an artist, Kapf, a professor of mathematics at Heilbronn, Frass, a barrister, Doctors Safer and Sicherer, physicians, Hyde, a magistrate, Baron von Hugel, etc., etc. But their perquisitions elicited no more than has been already narrated. All heard the noises, most of them saw the lights, and some saw the figure. Dutenhofer and Kapf saw it without a defined outline. It was itself bright, but it did not illuminate the room. Some of the sounds appeared to them like the discharging of a Leyden jar. There was also a throwing of gravel, and a heavy dropping of water, but neither to be found. Professor Kapf says he was quite cool and self-possessed, till there was such a violent concussion of the heavy barred window that he thought it must have come in. Then both he and Dutenhofer felt horror-struck. As they could not see the light emitted by the spectre when the room was otherwise lighted, they were in the dark. But they took every care to ascertain that Eslinger was in her bed while these things were going on. She prayed aloud the whole time, unless when speaking to them. By the morning, she used to be dreadfully exhausted from this continual exertion. It is also mentioned that the straw on which she lay was frequently changed and examined, and every means taken to ascertain that there was nothing whatever in her possession that could enable her to perform any sort of jugglery. Her fellow prisoners were also invited to tell all they knew or could discover, and a remission of their sentences promised to those who would make known the imposition, if there was one. Dr. Sicherer, who was accompanied by Mr. Frass, says that having heard of these phenomena, which he thought the more unaccountable from the circumstances of the woman's age and condition, etc., she being a healthy, hard-working person, aged 38, who had never known sickness, he was very desirous of inquiring personally into the affair. While they were in the court of the prison, waiting for admittance, they heard extraordinary noises which could not be accounted for, and during the night there was a repetition of those above described, especially the apparent throwing of gravel, or peas, which seemed to fall so near him that he involuntarily covered his face. Then followed the feeling of a cool wind, and then the oppressive odor, for which, he says, he can find no comparison, and which almost took his breath away. He was perfectly satisfied that it was no smell originating in the locality or the state of the prison. Simultaneously with the perception of this odor, he saw a thick grey cloud of no defined shape near Eslinger's bed. When this cloud disappeared, the odor was no longer perceptible. It was a fine moonlight night, and there was light enough in the room to distinguish the beds, etc. The same phenomena recurred several times during the night. Eslinger was heard, each time the ghost was there, praying and reciting hymns. They also heard her say, "Don't press my hands so hard together! Don't touch me!" etc. The voice of the spirit they did not hear. Towards 3 or 4 o'clock they heard heavy blows, footsteps, opening and shutting of the door, and a concussion of the whole house that made them think it was going to fall on their heads. About 6 o'clock they saw the phantom again, and altogether these phenomena recurred at least 10 times in the course of the night. Dr. Sicherer concludes by saying that he had undertaken the investigation with a mind entirely unprepossessed, and that in the report he made, at the desire of the Supreme Court, he had recorded his observations as conscientiously as if he had been upon a jury. He adds that he had examined everything, and that neither in the person of the woman nor in any of the other inmates of the prison could he find the smallest grounds for suspicion, nor any clue to the mystery, which in a scientific point of view appeared to him utterly inexplicable. Dr. Sicherer's report is dated Heilbronn, January 8, 1836. Mr. Frass, who accompanied him, confirms the above statement in every particular, with the addition that he several times saw a light of a varying circumference moving about the room, and that it was while he saw this that the woman told him the ghost was there. He also felt an oppression of the breath and a pressure on his forehead each time before the apparition came, especially once, when although he had carefully abstained from mentioning his sensations, she told him it was standing close at his head. He stretched out his hand but perceived nothing, except a cool wind and an overpowering smell. Dr. Safer being there one night, with Dr. Kerner, in order to exclude the possibility of light entering through the window, they stopped it up. They, however, saw the phosphorescent light of the spectre as before. It moved quietly about and remained a quarter of an hour. The room was otherwise perfectly dark. The sounds accompanying it were like the dropping of water and the discharge of a Leyden jar. They fully ascertained that these phenomena did not proceed from the woman. I have already given the depositions of Madame Weir, the wife of the deputy governor or keeper of the prison, who is spoken of as a highly respectable person. Weir himself, however, though quite unable to account for all these extraordinary proceedings, found great difficulty in believing that there was anything supernatural in the affair, and he told Eslinger that, if she wished him to be convinced, she must send the ghost to do it. He says, "The night after I had said this, I went to bed and to sleep, little expecting such a visitor, but toward midnight I was awakened by something touching my left elbow. This was followed by a pain, and in the morning, when I looked at the place, I saw several blue spots. I told Eslinger that this was not enough, and that she must tell the ghost to touch my other elbow. This was done on the following night, and at the same time I perceived a smell like putrefaction. The blue spots followed. It will be remembered that Eslinger had blue spots also." Weir continues to say that the spectre made known its presence in his chamber by various sounds, such as were heard in the other parts of the house. He never saw the figure distinctly, but his wife did. She always prayed when it was there. He, however, felt the cool wind that they all described. The ghost told Eslinger that he should continue his visits to the prison after she had quitted it, and he did so. The second night after her release they felt his approach, especially from the cool wind, and Madame Weir desired him to testify his presence to her husband. Immediately there were sounds like a wind instrument, and these were repeated at her desire. The prisoners also heard and felt the apparition after Eslinger's departure, and Weir says he is perfectly assured that in this jail, where the inmates were frequently changed, everybody was locked up, and every place thoroughly examined. It was utterly impossible for any trick to be played. Besides which, all parties agreed that the sounds were often of a description that could not have been produced by any known means. But it was not to the prison alone that this apparition confined his visits. To whomsoever Eslinger sent him, he went, testifying his presence by the same signs as above described. He visited the chambers of several of the magistrates, of a teacher named Neufer, of the Referendary Burger, of a citizen named Rummel, and many others. Of these, only some perceived his presence by the noises, the cool air, the smell, or the touch. Others saw the light also, and others perceived the figure with more or less distinctness. A Mr. Dorr of Heilbronn seems to have scoffed very much at these rumours, and Dr. Kerner bade Eslinger ask the ghost to convince him, which she did. Mr. Dorr says, "When I heard these things talked of, I always laughed at them, and was thought very sensible for so doing. Now I shall be laughed at in my turn, no doubt." He then relates that on the morning of the 30th of December, 1835, he awoke, as usual, about 5 o'clock, and was thinking of some business he had in hand, when he became conscious that there was something near him, and he felt as if it blew cold upon him. He started up, thinking some animal had got into his room, but could find nothing. Next he heard a noise like sparks from an electrical machine, and then a report close to his right ear. Had there been anything visible, it was light enough to see it. This report was frequently heard in the prison. Wherever the apparition once made a visit, he generally continued to go for several successive nights. He also visited Professor Kapff at Heilbronn and Baron von Hugel at Eschenau, without being desired to do so by Eslinger, and Neufer, whom he also went to, she knew nothing of. When he visited Dr. Kerner's chamber, his wife, who had prided herself on her incredulity and boasted of being born on St. Thomas's Day, was entirely converted, for she not only heard him but saw him distinctly. He visited them for several nights, accompanied by the noises and the light. One night, While lying awake observing these phenomena, they fancied they heard their horse come out of his stable, which was under their room. In the morning he was found standing outside with his halter on. It was not broken, and it was evident that the horse had not got loose by any violence. Moreover, the door of the stable was closed behind him, as it had been at night when he was shut up. Dr. Kerner's sister, who came from a distance to visit them, had heard very little about this affair. Yet she was awakened by a sound that seemed like someone trying to speak in her ear, and looking up, she saw 2 stars, like those described by Margaret Liebesberg. She observed that they emitted no rays. She also felt the cool air and perceived the corpse-like odor. This odor accompanied the ghost even when it appeared at Heilbronn. It is remarkable that some of these persons, both men and women, felt themselves unable to move or call out while the spectre was there, and that they were relieved the moment he went away. They appeared to be magnetized, but this feeling was by no means universal. Many were perfectly composed and self-possessed the whole time, and made their observations to each other. All agreed that the speaking of the apparition seemed like that of a person making efforts to speak. Now, as we are to presume that he did not speak by means of organs as we do, but that he had imitated the sounds of words as he imitated other sounds, by some means with which we are unacquainted, for since the noises were heard by everybody within hearing, we must suppose that they actually existed. We, who know the extreme difficulty of imitating human speech, may conceive how this imitation should be very defective. Duethenhofer and others remarked that there was no echo from the sounds, as well as that the phosphorescence shed no light around, and though the spectre could touch them, or produce the sensation that he did, they could not feel him, but as in all similar cases could thrust their hands through what appeared to be his body. The sensation of his falling tears and the marks they left seem most unaccountable, and yet in the records of a ghost that haunted the Countess of Eberstein in 1685 we find the same thing asserted. This account was made public by the authority of the consistoral court, and with the consent of the family. At length, on the 11th of February, the ghost took his departure from Eslinger. At least, after that day he was no more seen or heard by her or anybody else. He had always entreated her to go to Wimmenthal, where he had formerly lived, to pray for him, and after she was released from the jail, by the advice of her friends, she did it. Some of them accompanied her, and they saw the apparition near her while she was kneeling in the open air, though not all with equal distinctness. A very respectable woman called Werner, a stranger to Eslinger, whom she says she never saw or spoke to till that day, offered to make oath that she had accompanied her to Wimmenthal, and that, with the other friends, she had stood about 30 paces off, quite silent and still, while the woman knelt and prayed, and that she had seen the apparition of a man, accompanied by 2 smaller spectres hovering near her. When the prayer was ended, he went close to her, and there was a light like a falling star. Then I saw something like a white cloud that seemed to float away, and after that we saw no more. Eslinger had been very unwilling to undertake this expedition. She took leave of her children before she started, and evidently expected mischief would befall her, and now, on approaching her, they found her lying cold and insensible. When they had revived her, she told them that, on bidding her farewell, before he ascended, which he did, accompanied by 2 bright infantine forms, the ghost had asked her to give him her hand, and that after wrapping it in her handkerchief she had complied. A small flame had arisen from the handkerchief when he touched it, and we found the marks of his fingers like burns, but without any smell. This, however, was not the cause of her fainting, but she had been terrified by a troop of frightful animals that she saw rush past her when the spirit floated away. From this time nobody, either in the prison or out of it, was troubled by this apparition. This is certainly a very extraordinary story, and what is more extraordinary, such cases do not seem to be very uncommon in Germany. I meet with many recorded, and an eminent German scholar of my acquaintance tells me that he has also heard of several, and was surprised that we have no similar instances here. If these things occurred merely among Roman Catholics, we might be inclined to suppose that they had some connection to the notion of purgatory, but on the contrary, it appears to be among the Lutheran population they chiefly occur, insomuch that it has even been suggested that the omission of prayers for the dead in the Lutheran Church is the cause of the phenomenon. But on the other hand, as in the present case and in several others, the person that revisits the earth was of the Catholic persuasion when alive. We are bound to suppose that he had the benefit of his own church's prayers. I am here assuming that all the above strange phenomena were really produced by the agency of an apparition. If they were not, what were they? The 3 physicians who were among the visitors must have been perfectly aware of the contagious nature of some forms of nervous disorder, and from the previous incredulity of 2 of them, they must have been quite prepared to regard these phenomena from that point of view. Yet they seem unable to bring themselves under the category of sensuous illusions. The apparently electrical nature of the lights, and of several of the sounds, is very remarkable, as are also the swellings produced on some of the persons by the touch of the ghost, which remind us of Professor Hofer's case mentioned in a former chapter. The apparition of the dog and the lambs also, strange as they are by no means isolated cases. These appearances seem to be symbolical. The father had been evil, and had led his son to do evil, and he appeared in the degraded form of a dog. And the innocence of the children, who had been probably in some way wronged, was symbolized by their appearing as lambs. "If I had lived as a beast," said an apparition to the seeress of Prevorst, "I should appear as a beast." These symbolical transfigurations cannot appear very extravagant to those who accept the belief of many theologians that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was an evil spirit incarnated in that degraded form. How far the removal of the horse out of the stable was connected with the rest of the phenomena it is impossible to say, but a similar circumstance has very lately occurred with regard to a dog that was locked up in the house in this neighborhood, which I have several times alluded to, where footsteps and rustlings are heard, doors are opened, and a feeling that someone is blowing or breathing upon them is felt by the inhabitants. The holes burnt in the handkerchief are also quite in accordance with many other relations of the kind, especially that of the Maid of Orlach, and also that of the Hammerschen family, mentioned in Stilling's Pneumatology, when a ghost who had been, as he said, waiting 120 years for someone to release him by their prayers, was seen to take a handkerchief, on which he left the marks of his 5 fingers appearing like burnt spots. A Bible that he touched was marked in the same manner, and these 2 mementos of the apparition were carefully retained in the family. This particularity also reminds us of Lord Tyrone's leaving the marks of his hand on Lady Beresford's wrist, on which she ever afterward wore a black riband. In several instances I find it reported that when an apparition is requested to render himself visible to, or to enter into communication with, other persons besides those to whom he addresses himself, he answers that it is impossible, and in other cases that he could do it, but that the consequences to those persons would be pernicious. This, together with the circumstances of their waiting so long for the right person, tends strongly to support the hypothesis that an intense magnetic rapport is necessary to any facility of intercourse. It also appears that the power of establishing this rapport with one or more persons varies exceedingly among these denizens of the spiritual world, some being only able to render themselves audible, others to render themselves visible to one person, while a few seem to possess considerably greater powers or privileges. Another particular to be observed is that in many instances, if not in all, these spirits are what the Germans call gebannt, that is, banned, or prescribed, or as it were, tethered to a certain spot, which they can occasionally leave, as Anton did the cellar at Wimmenthal, to which he was gebannt, but from which they cannot free themselves. To this spot they seem to be attached, as by an invisible chain, whether by the memory of a crime committed there, or by a buried treasure, or even by its being the receptacle of their own bodies. In short, it seems perfectly clear, admitting them to be apparitions of the dead, that whatever the bond may be that keeps them down, they cannot quit the earth. They are, as St. Martin says, remainers, not returners. And this seems to be the explanation of haunted houses. In the year 1827, Christian Eisengrun, a respectable citizen of Neckarsteinach, was visited by a ghost of the above kind, and the particulars were judicially recorded. He was at Eherbach, in Baden, working as a potter, which was his trade, in the manufactory of Mr. Gehrig, when he was one night awakened by a noise in his chamber, and on looking up he saw a faint light, which presently assumed a human form, attired in a loose gown. He could see no head. He had his own head under the clothes, but he presently spoke, and told him that he was destined to release it, and for that purpose he must go to the Catholic churchyard of Neckarsteinach, and there, for 21 successive days, repeat the following verse from the New Testament before the stone sepulchre there. For what man knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of man which is in him? So the things of God knoweth no man, but the Spirit of God. 1 Corinthians 2:11. The ghost having repeated his visits and his request, the man consulted his master what he should do, and he advised him not to trifle with the apparition, but to do what he required, adding that he had known many similar instances. Upon this Eisengrun went to Neckarsteinach, and addressed himself to the Catholic priest there named Seitz, who gave him the same counsel, together with his blessing and also a hymn of Luther's, which he bade him learn and repeat, as well as the verse when he visited the sepulchre. As there was only one stone sepulchre in the churchyard, Eisengrun had no difficulty in finding it, and while he performed the service imposed on him by the ghost, the latter stood on the grave with his hands folded in prayer, but when he repeated the hymn, he moved rapidly backward and forward, still not overstepping the limits of the stone. The man, though very frightened, persevered in the thing for the time imposed, 21 days, and during this period he saw the perfect form of the apparition, which had no covering on its head except very white hair. It always kept its hands folded, and had large eyes, in which he never perceived any motion. This filled him with horror. Many persons went to witness the ceremony. The surviving nephews and nieces of the apparition brought an action against Eisengrun, and they contrived to have him seized and carried to the magistrate's house. One day, at the time he should have gone to the churchyard, but the ghost came and beckoned, and made signs to him to follow him, till the man was so much affected and terrified that he burst into tears. The two magistrates could not see the spectre, but feeling themselves affected with a cold shudder, they consented to his going. He was then publicly examined in court, together with the offended family and a number of witnesses, and the result was that he was permitted to continue the service for the 21 days, after which he never saw or heard more of the ghost, which had been formerly a rich timber merchant. The terror and anxiety attendant on these daily visits to the churchyard affected Eisengrun so much that it was some time before he recovered his usual health. He had all his life been a ghost-seer, but had never had communication with any before this event. The Catholic priest in this instance appears to have been more liberal than the deceased timber merchant, for the latter did not seem to like the Lutheran hymn which the former prescribed. His dissatisfaction, however, may have arisen from their making any addition to the formula he had himself indicated. Footnote 5. It is to be observed that this is the sensation asserted to be felt by Reichenbach's patients on the approach of the magnet. End of Chapter 15, Part 2.